Welcome to the Solid Signal Podcast for the week of October 12th, 2020. First, a little bit of business. We continue to upgrade our studio equipment over here, so if you're liking the way that the podcast sounds, or if you think it at least sounds the same and not any worse, leave a comment somewhere and I'll let you know if I'm able to make even more improvements. Second of all, I wanted to tell you this week that I finally saw the movie Cats. Now, this movie came out in late 2019, which by my reckoning is about 700 years ago. And I think that future historians will look at this film and they will say over time that this may have been the last big budget failure for the movie theater system. I firmly believe that movie theaters are not going to come back from the current crisis because really watching from home is a much better experience in so many ways. Oh, sure, you don't get the exact, gigantic screen kind of experience, and I get that. But on the other hand, it's more comfortable. You can pause whenever you need to. It's your own food. And most of the time, it doesn't even cost any more than going to the theater. In fact, it will generally cost less. So looking at Cats, I think, becomes a very interesting thing to do because it's a time capsule of a moment in time. In December 2019, we had no idea what this year was going to be like. And yet, much like other times in the history of our country and our world, you're able to sense months in advance that there was something going on, something about to happen. For example, you sense a lot of tension in 1939. Movies made in 1939 are often thought of as being some of the best. And one of the reasons for that was there was this very jangly, tense feeling in the world that somehow comes out in movies and makes them better. Even though nobody knew what was going to happen in the fall of 1939, somehow movies presaged that a little bit. Interestingly enough, you see a lot of the same kind of thing happening in 1999 and 2000. Which you can attribute to the millennium, which, Y2K hysteria, that sort of thing. But I tend to attribute more toward the way the world changed in September of 2001. All of that is ancient history, and especially as we live here in 2020. But it's interesting, I think, to look at the films of 2019, especially Cats, coming out when it did, and see if it really has something to tell us about what the future would eventually bring. Cats is not just a failed movie. It's a failed movie in almost every way, which makes it kind of interesting. If you're not familiar with the film at all, it was based on a stage play by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Mr. Lloyd Webber's work is not necessarily held in the highest regard right now. It was very well regarded in the 1980s in the theater, but somehow right now it's not considered terribly good. I tend to disagree. I think that time will show that it is good on its own terms, but this movie is not. The idea of Cats as a stage play was that you just kind of took a bunch of cats singing about a bunch of stuff. It was based on a book of poetry written by T.S. Eliot, a famous poet, but that particular book was really just a list of poems that he had written for a child, and so they are not necessarily the deepest or most interesting of Mr. Eliot's catalog. By taking these poems and setting them to music and creating a giant spectacle on the stage, people were just enthralled by Cats in the 1980s and into the 1990s. But yet it was considered unfilmable in the same way that a lot of other things were considered unfilmable. Because in essence, you're talking about cats who are also humans, and how do you do that without making it look extremely stupid? The answer, apparently, as we have learned, is you don't. They do, in fact, look extremely stupid. Let's back up a little bit. I watched Cats on HBO Max, and Cats is on HBO Max if you happen to have it because you subscribe to HBO on satellite TV or because you subscribe to it separately, but you'd hardly ever know it. I had to go looking real hard to find this thing, Normally, HBO's streaming premieres are there right at 5 o'clock Pacific time, 8 o'clock Eastern time. This one didn't drop until about half hour later, and then you really had to go digging through the menus to find it. There was nothing on the main screen that announced it was there. It was more like, okay, well, if you really have to watch Cats, you're going to watch Cats. It's also kind of odd that Cats is even on HBO Max because it was distributed by Universal Pictures, which is a Comcast company. So if you're going to put it anywhere, you'd think that they put it on Peacock. And they didn't. They put it on HBO Max. So it's almost as if NBC Universal and Comcast were so ashamed of this film they let somebody else have it, and then maybe AT&T, who owns HBO, regretted buying it, and so they didn't really want to promote it. So that was kind of my entry into the entire world of Cats, the film. I guess it's probably best next to talk about what didn't go wrong. The songs, for the most part, are pretty good. They are, for the most part, the same songs that were performed on Broadway. And the staging was pretty good, and there are a lot of good dancers in this production, but then things begin to twist in a bad direction. The music itself, while it's good, seems limp and uninspiring. A couple of songs were changed for absolutely no reason, and I don't just mean one or two words. I mean they changed all of the music for whatever reason, and they made it worse. I gotta say, I don't know why. Then let's go on to the CGI. A lot was made of the CGI initially. When this film was announced, they said, okay, well, pretty much all the characters are going to be walking around in blue leotards in front of blue screen, and nothing is going to be real, so we can do anything we want, and we're going to do it really well. So they did do anything they wanted, but they didn't do it really well. The CGI is rushed in places. There are some places it doesn't quite work, where it doesn't look like somebody's really standing on something that they should be standing on, or things don't move naturally in the way that they should. This is simply because they did not spend enough time, did not spend enough money, and I don't feel bad talking about this, but I do feel bad for the CGI artists who simply just weren't given enough time to do their jobs. That's just really super duper obvious. But, other films have had bad CGI. The CGI in this is so bad because it's just incomplete. There are some spots where human hands show up on otherwise furry creatures, and where things don't move, or collars kind of dangle in midair and they shouldn't. And all in all, it just gives you the feeling like you're paying attention to something that maybe you shouldn't be paying attention to. It should be completely seamless. It should just work, and it doesn't. Kind of the problem there. The set design, okay, is actually kind of a little bit of an extension of the stage set. It doesn't quite ever know whether it's real or imagined. There are some inconsistencies as far as how big the actual cats are supposed to be in relation to the environment. But again, that's a consequence of not having time to go through it and look at it a second time. I almost don't blame him for that. Where I do blame him is just that this film feels limp. It feels uninteresting. And in comparison to the stage show, which is so great to look at, I don't even know how you do that. There's no heart or emotion in this film, and I don't know how you create that, but I do know that they really didn't do it here. It's a shame. It's a shame because I feel like a lot of work was put into this film. A lot of work was put into this film, and yet to have it fail the way that it did was just really a kind of sad. There were a lot of really good people in this film. Dame Judi Dench was in this film, for example. And the music should have been better. It had Jennifer Hudson, who should have done a much better job. And really, it didn't. It just didn't. The confusion, the inconsistencies, and I think the film even fails to be spectacularly bad, which I guess is the biggest surprise for me. I had been led to believe this was going to be something between a 1960s acid trip and some sort of experimental cinema. But aside from the fact that Rebel Wilson strips off her skin to reveal other skin behind it and feasts on dancing cockroaches, that sounds like it's really outre, but it's not. Believe it or not, it's actually in context. This film fails to shock, and guess that's the surprising part, is it's not even interesting enough to be truly shocking. It's just a failure. It's a failure of promotion. It's a failure of imagination. It's a failure of execution, of music, of staging, of dancing, and it really makes you kind of wonder. I mean, here was a film that got greenlit and probably never should have been. Everybody should have known this was not a film that could have been made. But okay, they said, oh, we made Avatar or whatever, then, or other films that said they couldn't be made. And this one is another one that couldn't be made, and they said, okay, it can't be made, and they made it. But the biggest question, I guess, I had here as I was watching this film, which unfolded in a sort of a slow, almost train wrecky kind of way, was didn't they notice at some point that it was just going to be truly bad? They could have put this off for a year to improve the effects if they thought that was going to do it, or they could have retooled it and reorchestrated. New music would have made a lot of difference. Re-recording things so they were brighter and happier could have made a difference. Changing some of the technology or even some of the casting could have been better. There's an actor, and I hesitate to say that word, by the name of Jason Derulo, who I do not care for as a musician. I'm sure he's talented. I simply do not care for him. But he seemed spectacularly unsuited to anything in this film, which they could have absolutely recast and reshot him. Or they could have done that with James Corden, who also seemed like didn't make a lot of sense in this film. I mean, even within its own context. They could have done any number of things, and they didn't. Instead, at some point, somebody subscribed to what I tend to call the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is the idea that you've put enough time and effort into something, you may as well see it through. The easiest way to get kind of around the sunk cost fallacy is to think of yourself as walking or biking or driving. If you know that you should have gone east and you are going west, well, you're not going to say, I've gone pretty west at this point, I guess I'll just go all the way around the planet and come back and I'll eventually get there. No, you don't. It's never too late to turn around and make something right. That's the truth of the sunk cost fallacy, and it's obviously something that the producers of Cats never considered. I think everybody who was involved in this must have been at some point disappointed with the final result, knowing that it was maybe as good as it could be for the time frame, but not as good as it should be. And that makes me sad, because the one thing that is extremely clear about this film is that a lot of time and money was spent. I know a lot of CGI artists, they said, like slept under their desks and were working 90-hour weeks, and yet this is what we got. The same thing with the musicians. People put in effort making that music. People put in that effort producing it. People put in that effort designing the entire thing. And yet it didn't work. I guess the final little bit of it, which kind of was the cherry on top for this movie, is that I noticed dropped frames throughout. Dropped frames are what happens when, for example, if you're putting your film out to a service like HBO Max, which goes out in 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second for the most part, and you're delivering something at 24 frames per second, occasionally you're going to get a little bit of a drop. You can solve this kind of thing by actually putting out 24 frames per second when you record something at 24 frames per second, or in the case of a CGI film like this, you could create a new render at 30 or 60 and it would be fine, and people do it all the time. It was just one more way in which I thought this film just didn't work, and why I was so incredibly surprised by it. I guess I've rambled on for quite a while about this film Cats and how it is a surprising failure, but also I kind of wonder if we revisit this time sometime in the future, 5 years from now or even 50 years from now? Will we look at cats as the last gasp of an over budgeted studio system that was simply cranking out entertainment to be seen on the large screen for the last time? Or will we see it as some sort of expression of the tension that was building up, even though we did not know what was coming? Maybe we knew that something was. That's it for this extremely large and long podcast. I think this may be the longest one I've ever recorded. I hope that you had a good listen to it. I thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.